welcome to Logos Live. I'm Robert Martin, Director of the City Bible Forum in Melbourne, and I'm your host for the show. Logos is Greek for word or message, and Logos Live engages the Christian message before a live audience in Melbourne. Now, one of the most popular components of Logos Live is the testimonies, where we hear stories of how God has transformed the lives of our guests. In this episode, I've gathered together 6 of the most engaging and powerful stories of transformation we've heard on the show. The stories, like our guests, are varied and unexpected, but all the changes are for the better. Our first story is that of Michelle Monro. Michelle joined us to speak about why there never seems to be enough time in our Time Poor, Soul Rich series. She's an adjunct lecturer at Melbourne School of Theology and gave a very moving account of how God has changed her life. So Michelle, what convinced you in the first place to become a Christian believer?
Do you know, I don't think the question is what convinced me in the first place. I think the question is what has kept me convinced. So I grew up in a Christian home, always went to church, always had a sense that God was real and that he was my friend and that he was involved in my life. Became a firm believer in my teenage years. But I've been through many hardships in my life. My brother died in a sudden car accident on the way home from his honeymoon, he and his wife, when I was 22, and he was very, very close to me, so that was very devastating and hard to manage. My husband and I tried for 7 years to have children. We went through IVF, and that was incredibly challenging. And my kidney disease, and my husband actually gave me a kidney 4.5 years ago as a preemptive transplant to avoid dialysis, but unsuccessfully. That lasted for 18 months and then failed, which is very unusual. So we've had a lot of hard times. I've had a lot of hardships and challenges and difficult things. And I think a lot of people would look at that and say, well, why do you still believe in God when you've been through all of those things? And for me, the answer is I would not survive if I didn't believe in God. God has kept me. God has held me. God has answered the bigger questions, not in terms of, it's all for a purpose and there's going to be good in the end, but in terms of God loves me in the midst of those things. God is good to me. God protects me. Even though things aren't going the way that I'd like them to go, I still feel the love of God. I still feel the peace of God in my heart. I still feel that he is my guardian and protector. And if he was not there, I honestly don't think I would be alive. I certainly wouldn't be happy.
Wow. Yes, it's a very powerful story. Our next story of transformation is Shane Rogerson's. Shane is pastor of St Matt's Anglican Church in Prahran and joined us to speak about the resurrection of Jesus. I must confess I didn't know much about Shane's story, and when I heard it, I was quite stunned. So let's hear his story now. Shane, welcome. You're a pastor of a church now, but you've not always been a Christian believer. Can you tell us a little bit about your story? What convinced you to be a follower of Jesus?
Sure, I'd love to. I've been a Christian quite some time now, but I did not grow up in a context of family where there was religious belief, although that has changed a little bit since I've become a Christian. I think whilst I was in a family of indifferent or apathetic people when it came to religious belief, in my teens and into my early 20s, I kind of had developed as a left-wing Marxist atheist.
Right. Okay, wow.
And
how did that manifest itself?
Well...
Did you go marching, storming the city?
Yes, I wanted to burn the Reichstag and do all those things. No, it was interesting because middle-class Sydney is where I grew up, but I came from I'd say it was a working-class background. So a single mum who married a guy with a degree, moved to the leafy suburbs, and we're kind of in that aspirational middle-class existence, good school, safe environment.
This is where you became a Marxist.
The Hills District, I would never live there, but I have lots of friends and family who live there. It was quite common for people to, do religious education in school. Everyone went along, but I always really struggled with that. But I had some friends who were believing Christians, and not just culturally so. They actually were very serious about their faith. They wanted to share their faith with me, and there was a couple of extremely good-looking girls in particular who were interested in sharing their faith with me, and so I was very interested in exploring that with them.
So a left-wing Marxist atheist, what convinced you?
I was more convinced of atheism having engaged with Christians to begin with.
Right.
So what I did is I explored Christianity. I was apathetic and indifferent myself. I explored the Christian faith with my friends, and I think I came to understand something of the logic of the Christian message. I understood kind of how it fitted together and how it explained the world. But fundamentally, I didn't like the idea of any other person running my life. I did, though, want a coherent worldview. And therefore I had to go and find an alternative explanation. If Christianity wasn't going to be the thing, I thought, well, I'm going to find something alternate to Christianity which sort of answers some of the questions I had in life. And I ended up progressively moving towards the left politically and adopting socialism and then kind of more idealised forms of communism. But it was not the right time in world history to be doing that, because communists were losing, the wall was coming down, and I was trying to say, no, hold those bricks up, But what it did, it gave me a compelling worldview in terms of left-wing Marxism. It gave me something to fight for, but at the same time I could sleep with whoever I wanted to sleep with.
You felt it was a liberating worldview?
Well, it both gave you purpose, but it also gave you a sense of freedom at the same time, personally and morally. And so I rejected Christianity, I rejected Christian faith, and over about 2.5 years I continued to engage with my Christian friends, because the thing that I found quite annoying is that there was many ideals within the Christian community and the way they treated each other which I found incredibly compelling. I just didn't think that Jesus had to be the centre of that.
So what changed?
In one sense, the wheels fell off for me personally and morally. When there's within an atheist worldview, I began to think a lot about what really gives meaning to what we're doing. Not only was the wall collapsing, but my own life was, in a sense, that project of autonomy was not working. Failed relationship, drug and alcohol issues, a sense of nihilism. What's the meaning? What's the purpose? If it all ends in death, life then is essentially chaotic. Then why do I bother? And that was crystallised for me with a Christian friend's father, a man called Douglas Orr, who was a scientist. And I can remember having a conversation with him where, he kind of asked the bigger questions of life and really said, Shane, what's the point of living if you think it all ends in death? And I said, well, there's justice and there's fighting for right and these things. And he sort of just ripped the carpet out on me a little bit and helped me to see that if things all end in death, whether I died yesterday or today or tomorrow, he just sort of said, what is life really worth? What is life really about if it all ends in death? And he graphically illustrated that for me. He said, Shane, what if if it all ends in death, and it doesn't really matter what we do now, and there is no right and wrong, there's just survival of the fittest or the fastest or the fattest, and he won on all three counts there. And he said, what if I was to go and grab my .22 out of the cupboard and shoot you? He said, what would that mean? You couldn't say it was right or wrong, it was evil or abhorrent. It's just I'm bigger and faster than you with the trigger. And as I began to explore that with him, he sort of showed me that my life would rot on the carpet, and if they left it there long enough, all the water would evaporate from it, and what would be left was a pile of chemicals and minerals, which he suggested he could bag up, take it to the local garden centre and get $5 for. And
your life is worth $5.
Is your life worth $5? Was the question. And in the scale of things, that helped me to be much more honest about the moral framework that I was appealing to, and the sense of purpose in life. And that really opened up a deeper question about the Christian worldview, the historical claims of Jesus, Christian hope, resurrection, etc.
And it sounds like hope was a big factor in you considering the Christian message, or the lack of hope in the alternatives.
Absolutely. In fact, it was the lack of hope in the alternative, which in a sense drove me to the edge of a cliff. And Douglas Orr very kindly drove me to the edge of the cliff and said, "Do you want to go there?" And I said, "Well, just hang on, let's just take 2 steps back and think about alternatives at that point." But one of the things that was really helpful for me, I had problems with the historicity of the resurrection, which I knew was absolutely central to the Christian faith. So the Apostle Paul says, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then your
faith is futile.
Your faith is futile. It's crazy. And so I knew that was central. But I heard a person say, even if you don't believe in resurrection, you should want it to be true. Because if everything ends in death, then everything that you might think is important, things like justice and care for the poor, and they really end the same way. They end in death. And so why bother fighting for those things? If in the end it all ends in death, why not just eat, drink and marry, for tomorrow we die? But even then I tried that and I still wasn't happy. And so that having come to sort of explore the hopelessness of facing death, I read a little bit of Tolstoy and those kind of things, so I thought I was doing it in a more philosophical way. But fundamentally, I just couldn't live that way. And I thought, well, I'm prepared to explore things like the historical basis for Christianity and see if there is actually something in this guy Jesus rising from death and the hope that apparently brought.
And in the rest of that Logos Live episode, Shane talked more about the historical basis of Jesus' resurrection and the hope it brings. A really great listen. Our next story belongs to Tracy Lauersen. Tracy is Associate Vicar of St Hilary's Anglican Church in Kew and is the director of the Peter Corney Training Centre. And her story, well, is one of persistence. So let's hear it now.
Thank
welcome,
you.
Tracy. I'm glad that you could join us here today.
Thank you.
Now, you've been working in a church for a long time and have been a Christian believer for many years. Can you tell us what convinced you to become a Christian in the first place?
Great question. When I was a teenager, a friend at school invited me along to her church, her youth group, and I went there from time to time over a number of years. I also made a friend there who was at my school as well, and she kept following me up. Like, she'd keep inviting me to stuff. So if
she was a bit annoying, was she?
She was a bit annoying at times. So if I hadn't been to church for a while, she'd invite me back. And I mean, this went on for about 6 years. Right. She was very persistent. She was very successful, I have to say. I'm the godmother of her daughter, and we've been solid friends for decades and decades. But at the time, she was just someone who cared enough to keep inviting me in to hear the message about Jesus. And on one of those occasions, I did go and hear with her a preacher who was preaching from a passage in the Old Testament, Psalm 51. It's a psalm about a king who does some terrible things, and he's asking God to forgive him. And as the preacher preached from this passage, I think even though I'd been in and out of church for many years, it was a real penny-dropping moment for me to comprehend what sin was, that the king who was praying this prayer that's recorded in the Bible had done something terrible, and that God actually has a standard. The king hadn't achieved it. And as I reflected on my own life, I thought, I have to acknowledge that the life I am living is not one that God would be happy with. And then the flip side to that is the forgiveness that's offered in Jesus Christ and this incredible fresh start. And even way back when the king writes this, long before Christ came, it's claiming a forgiveness that is made available in Jesus. And I think having heard this, it struck me, I thought, well, I actually understand this, and I think it's all true. and I've got to make a choice. And I realise that even if I make no choice, that's a choice in itself, to walk away from what I understand. So I went back to my home. I was living in Canberra at the time, and prayed a prayer to God that he would forgive me. And then I rang my friend who was living in Sydney, and I said, come down next weekend and help me to find a church.
Wow.
I was in my early 20s at this stage, and I think because I'd become a Christian, come to faith in Jesus as an adult, and I hadn't grown up in a Christian family. I grew up in a wonderful family, but not a believing family. And I was just struck with how little I knew about the God that I'd put my faith in. So pretty quickly I got this idea that I could take myself off to Bible college and study for a few years. And I did that about a year and a half later, and here we go.
Boots and all.
That's right, boots and all,
you want to make a decision. So it wasn't simply that you made the decision to appease your friend. Finally, I'll just do it to get her off my back.
No, but I'm grateful for her persistence, and it actually encourages me when I, invite my friends to church and they go no, and I think in my mind that's such a big deal. In their mind, they've forgotten it in half an hour, So I'll keep being persistent.
Right, okay. Victor Sue is pastor of Reach Community Church, and his story is fascinating because the seeds were sown a long time before they bore fruit. So let's hear what happened. Welcome, Victor. We're glad that you can join us here today. Now, you've been a Christian believer for over 35 years. Do you remember back to those dark ages many years ago when you decided to become a Christian believer? What was it that convinced you to follow Jesus?
When I was young, my earliest recollection was going to church when I was 4 or 5 years old, and it was Christmas. And of course, I didn't understand any of the message except that I got a Christmas gift. I went back very, very happy. And that was my earliest recollection. That church is fun. They give you presents. And after that, I never went back to church. And I never knew about church. And that was when I was 4 or 5.
Right.
So then in my teenage years, I started wondering about the meaning of life. And I come from Malaysia. That's my origins, and there are a lot of religions. So I've seen a lot of them. So I often ask, when in where I go to school, the first day of each year, there'll be a roll call. They'll call you, and you got to say yes. And the next thing is religion. So when it came to me, it says, Victor Sue, religion, none. Then the next
obviously person, that Christmas present wasn't enough to convince you.
No, it didn't look. It didn't seem to be so.
Right. Okay.
I'm thankful of that too.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Otherwise, that'd be it. I thought that there'd be no more seeking.
Yeah.
So anyway, eventually I asked a lot of these people of their faith, what made them become to believe in their God, and I could not get a very, very convincing answer. And until I came to Australia, I was still seeking, And I came to know God as my Lord and my Savior, which is Jesus.
What was it that particularly convinced you?
As I mentioned, I've seen all these religions. The background to all of these religions never seemed to be credible to me.
Right.
And many of these founders of all these religions never claimed to be God. And what was a clincher for me was that history proved that there was a man called Jesus, and he died and he rose again.
Yep.
According to what was written, according to his prophecy and other prophecies. And that was really the deal. And subsequent to that I went to church for 5 weeks. I observed Christians, and they seemed to be more credible. They seemed to be happier. So, and it led me back to when I was 4 or 5 years old. I said, hey, these people are just as happy. And I'd like to have a life like that. And they seem to know where they're going, unlike many other faiths. Or religions.
So credibility was a big issue for Victor. Credibility of the message and of the messengers. Anne Winckel wrote a book for the inescapably busy called Time Poor, Soul Rich. The book is so good, we did a whole Logos Live series based on it. Anne's story of transformation starts with her dad, which in itself is quite a remarkable and unusual testimony. You're a Christian believer and you grew up in a Christian home on a farm. But the way your father became a Christian believer is intriguing. Can you tell us what happened?
I actually grew up with lots of stories from my parents about encounters with God, so I couldn't escape that when I was a kid. Mm-hmm. And the story of how my dad became a Christian is fascinating because he grew up in a non-Christian family. By the time he was in his early 20s, he was a stockman. He used to be he was a shy stockman, so he rode his horse around a big station in the country, and he basically was pretty depressed by the time he was in his early 20s. In fact, this particular day, he was driving in a car and feeling quite suicidal and felt life wasn't giving him what he was looking for, and he was flicking through the radio stations. This is actually a radio story. He got to a radio station that had a preacher on it, and he went to flick on, except that the words that came out of the voice of the preacher were, "And if you're driving along in a car and you're feeling suicidal." So he paused and listened. And interestingly, the preacher went on to talk about Jesus and what it meant that Jesus died on the cross and what it meant to become a Christian. And the preacher said the sinner's prayer at the end. He said, if you want to know God, pray this prayer with me. And apparently, the way my dad tells the story, he prayed the sinner's prayer a bit tongue-in-cheek. Like, he wasn't overly earnest about it. But what happened was remarkable. He got zapped by God and he drove off the road onto the side of the road, absolutely having had an encounter with the living God. And then he was so excited, he had to find a church and he started to pursue the idea of getting baptized because he knew that was the next thing he had to do. So he joined a church to get baptized and then unjoined it because he didn't want to be a member of a church, but he did want to get baptized.
Right, wow.
So, yeah, he thoroughly met God unexpectedly by listening to the radio.
Wow, yeah. So if you're listening to this in the radio, just stay on the road. Is that what you're suggesting? Or?
Stay listening. Stay listening.
Okay, so that shaped obviously your childhood, and yes. Whilst you would have always claimed to have been a Christian believer yourself, there's one particular instance when you were 16, which was particularly formative in your thinking.
I knew you were going to bring that up.
Well, yeah. Well, tell us what happened. It's an interesting story.
I don't really remember not kind of believing that God was out there. And of course, when you've got very prayerful parents, it's easy to sort of rely on their coat straps, if you know what I mean. But when I was 16, I was getting a bit older and I decided I needed to talk to God more myself. And I was kind of fancying this particular guy who was a skiing instructor. I hope he's not listening. And he was 19, I was 16, and I knew that all the couples at the beach were going up onto Lover's Lane to sort of do nookie. And as a good Christian girl, I decided I needed to check out with God what this meant. So I actually said a prayer, very, very specific prayer. Dear God, how far can I go? And, I really wanted an answer. And bizarrely, into my head came an answer immediately, and I didn't know what it meant. A Bible verse popped into my head, seriously. Romans 12, 1 and 2. And I didn't know what that was, so I'm like flicking through my Bible. What is this? What is this? And you know what it said, by the mercies of God, let your body be a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. And I'm thinking, darn, because I was looking for specific instructions. I wasn't going to sleep with the guy. I just wanted to know how far could I go. And clearly God was saying, not very. And I was like, oh, that's not what I was looking for. And I completely ignored it, went up onto Lover's Lane with the chap. It was very, there's nothing serious much going on, but I knew
so
that
we are a G-rated show.
Nothing terribly bad happened. But I knew I had completely ignored the answer that God had given me. And what was really interesting was, the story of Adam and Eve in the garden. When Adam and Eve supposedly sinned and did the naughty thing by eating the fruit on the tree, they couldn't look God in the eye, and it says they went and hid. Well, I was doing that. I could not look God in the eye, and literally I couldn't talk to God for about 2 weeks or 3 weeks. I just could not look God in the eye. I knew I'd disobeyed, or if you like, just ignored his kind of advice. Until this particular Sunday when my dad was preaching. He was a lay preacher in the church, and he was talking about why Jesus died for us. And I was, having grown up in a Christian home, I knew the answers to all the questions. And he said, what did Jesus die to free us from? And I'm thinking, yeah, Jesus died to free us from sin. And I was so not listening to my father's preaching.
Was that common? Did you often not listen to what he said?
No, my dad's not listening either. Right. No. I used to listen, but, right then I was in this guilt thing. So my dad boomed out this answer. He goes, Jesus died to free us from the guilt of sin. And I had this little mini revelation that, in fact, guilt was the very thing that we were meant to be freed from. So I was kind of relieved to hear that at the time.
Well, thanks so much for sharing that, Anne. That's terrific. Our final story of transformation is that of Guy Mason. Guy appeared in our God versus the World series in an episode where we talked about the objection of church hypocrisy. Guy is presently pastor of City on a Hill, a large church in Melbourne, but he grew up never going to church at all. What changed? Well, hear his story now. Well, welcome, Guy. It's great that you can join us here today.
It's good to be here.
Now, today we're thinking about the church, but you didn't grow up going to the church, did you?
No, that's right.
Tell us what happened.
Yeah, most of my life I never went to church, never talked about God or believed in God. To be honest, Jesus was nothing but a swear word to me and most members in my family. So, but I think like most Australians, was gripped by the bigger questions of life, like the ones that you were seeking to explore. And I think I'd experienced some of the goodness of life. You know, Australia is a great culture to be part of, good sport, good music, good friends, all those things. But I'd also experienced some of the garbage of life as well. And when you kind of, bring those two worlds together, you have to begin searching and wondering and looking up and asking why. And so when I was about 14, 15 years of age, it was actually through a friend. I was given a Bible. Yep. I considered myself a bit of a songwriter at the time and thought there might be some cool lyrics in there. Yep. And so one night I opened it up and I was captivated by this person, Jesus.
Did you find any lyrics?
No. Oh, well, yes and no, but but more importantly, drawn to him and his courage, his conviction to speak truth, not only historical truth, but experiential truth. It was making sense of the world that I was seeing, both the goodness of the world, but also the garbage as well. His conviction to challenge religious hypocrisy, which I'm sure we'll talk about a bit later, and then to suffer and die for me. I knew I was running my own race. I knew what sin was. I lived it. To think that Jesus would die for my sin was radically transforming to me. And so I was really kind of committed to two things at that point, and that was to know more about this Jesus and to want to make this Jesus known.
And I suppose that's led to your life since that.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I've continued to want to be on a journey to know more about Jesus. You know, the Bible's like the ocean and takes a minute to dive in, but a lifetime to explore. But equally, I'm passionate about helping other people come to know who Jesus really is. I think there are a lot of perceptions out there of who God is and what the Bible's about. I certainly had misguided understanding of who God was. I know my family did as well. And so I wanted other people to see him. I still do.
And hence, I suppose being a pastor of a church is a good place to make that happen.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So that's all we have time for today. 6 powerful and inspiring stories of transformation. We hope you've enjoyed the best of Logos Live. Logos Live is recorded before a live audience in the CBD of Melbourne over lunchtime every second Wednesday. You can be part of the audience. Just check out citybibleforum.org/Melbourne for the recording schedule. You're welcome to turn up or continue to tune in whenever Logos Live is broadcast or podcast. I look forward to you joining us next time for Logos Live.